Good morning. This is part 2. This is kind of like chapter 4, although they're not numbered. The Carpenters. For 2 days, the white fog was so thick that a man couldn't be seen 2 paces away. But then there wasn't much opportunity to take long walks alone. Somehow you could guess the direction of the mess hall, the hospital, the guardhouse. Those few points we had to be able to find. That same sense of direction that animals possess perfectly to awaken in man under the right conditions. The men were not shown the thermometer, but that was unnecessary since they had to work in any weather. Besides, long-time residents of Kolyma could determine the weather precisely even without a thermometer. If there was frosty fog, that meant the temperature outside was 40 degrees below zero. If you exhaled easily, but in a rasping fashion, it was 50 degrees below zero. If there was a rasping and it was difficult to breathe, it was 60 degrees below. After 60 degrees below zero, spit froze in midair. Spit had been freezing in midair for 2 weeks. Pushover woke each morning with the hope that the cold had let up during the night. He knew from last winter's experience that no matter how low the temperature was, a sharp change was necessary for a feeling of warmth. If the frost were to weaken its grip even to 40 or 50 degrees below zero, it would be warm for 2 days, and there was no sense in planning more than 2 days ahead. But the cold kept up, and Pushover knew he couldn't hold out any longer. Breakfast sustained his strength for no more than an hour of work, and then exhaustion ensued. Frost penetrated the body to the marrow of the bone. The phrase was no metaphor. A man could wave his pick or shovel, jump up and down so as not to freeze, till dinner. Dinner was hot. A thin broth and 2 spoons of kasha that restored one's strength only a little, but nevertheless provided some warmth. And then there was strength to work for an hour, and after that Pushover felt himself in the grip of the cold. The day would finally come to a close, and after supper all the workers would take their bread back to the barracks, where they would eat it, washing it down with a mug of hot water. Not a single man would eat his bread in the mess hall with his soup. After that, Pushover would go to sleep. He slept, of course, on one of the upper berths, because the lower ones were like an ice cellar. Everyone who had a lower berth would stand half the night at the stove, taking turns with his neighbors in embracing it. The stove retained a slight remnant of warmth. There was never enough firewood, because to go for it meant a 4-kilometer walk after work, and everyone avoided the task. The upper berths were warmer, but even so, everyone slept in his working clothes: hats, padded coats, pea jackets, felt pants. Even with the extra warmth, by the morning, a man's hair would be frozen to the pillow. Pushover felt his strength leave him every day. A 30-year-old man, he had difficulty in climbing onto an upper berth, even getting down from it. His neighbor had died yesterday. The man simply didn't wake up, and no one asked for the cause of death, as if there were only one cause that everyone knew. The orderly was happy that the man died in the morning and not in the evening. Since the orderly got the dead man's ration for the day, everyone realized this, and Pushover screwed up his courage to approach the orderly. "Break off a piece of the crust," he asked, but the orderly cursed him as only a man whose weakness lent him strength could. Patashnikov felt silent and walked away. He had to take some action, think of something with his weakened mind. Either that or die. Patashnikov had no fear of death, but he couldn't rid himself of a passionate, secret desire, a last stubbornness, to live. He didn't want to die here in the frost, under the boots of the guards, in the barracks with its swearing, dirt and total indifference written on every face. He bore no grudge for people's indifference, for he had long since comprehended the source of that spiritual dullness. The same frost that transformed a man's spit into ice in midday also penetrated the soul. If bones could freeze, then the brain could also be dulled and the soul could freeze over. And the soul shuddered and froze, perhaps to remain frozen forever. Patashnikov had lost everything except the desire to survive, to endure the cold and remain alive. Having gulped down his bowl of warm soup, Patashnikov was barely able to drag himself to the work area. The work gang stood at attention before beginning work, and a fat, red-faced man in a deerskin hat and a white leather coat walked up and down the rows in Yakut deerskin boots. He peered into their exhausted, dirty faces. The gang foreman walked up and respectfully spoke to the man in the deerskin hat. "I really haven't got anyone like that, Alexander Yevgenyevich. You'll have to try Sobolev and the petty criminal element. These are all intellectuals, Alexander Yevgenyevich. They're a pain in the neck." The man in the deerskin hat had stopped to look over the men and turned to the gang foreman. "Foremen don't know their people. They don't want to know, and they don't want to help us," he said hoarsely. "Have it your way, Alexander Yevgenyevich." Excuse me for a second. I gotta shit. Sorry. "I'll show you. What's your name?" "My name's Ivanov, Alexander Yevgenyevich." "Just watch." "Hey guys, attention." The man in the deerskin hat walked up to the work gang. "The camp administration needs carpenters to make boxes to haul dirt." Everyone was silent. "You see, Alexander Yevgenyevich," the foreman whispered. Patashnikov suddenly heard his own voice. "I'm a carpenter," and he stepped forward. Another man stepped forward on his right. Patashnikov knew him. It was Grigoryev. "Well," said the man in the deerskin hat, turning to the foreman, Are you an incompetent asshole or not? Okay, fellows, follow me." Patashnikov and Grigoryev stumbled after the man in the deerskin hat. He stopped. "At this pace," he said hoarsely, "we won't make it even by dinner time. Here's what. I'll go ahead and you go to the shop and ask for the foreman, Sergeyev. You know where the carpentry shop is." We know, Grigoryev said in a loud voice. "Please give us a smoke." "I think I've heard that request before," the man in the deerskin hat muttered, and pulled out 2 cigarettes without removing the pack from his pocket. Patashnikov walked ahead and thought frantically. Today he would be in the warmth of the carpentry shop. He'd sharpen an axe and make a handle, and sharpen the saw. No sense hurrying. He could kill time till dinner signing out, tools, and finding the quartermaster. By evening, he'd realize he didn't know how to make an axe handle or sharpen a saw, and they'd kick him out. Tomorrow, he'd have to return to the work gang, but today he'd be warm. Maybe he could remain a carpenter tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, if Grigoryev was a carpenter. He'd be Grigoriev's helper. Winter was nearly over. Somehow he'd survived the short summer. Potashnikov stopped and waited for Grigoriev. "Do you know how to be a carpenter?" he asked, holding his breath in sudden hope. "Well, you see," said Grigoriev cheerfully, "I was a graduate student at the Moscow Philological Institute. I don't see why anyone with a higher education, especially one in the humanities, can sharpen an axe and set the teeth on a saw, particularly if he has to do it next to a hot stove. That means you can't do it either. It doesn't mean anything. We'll fool them for 2 days. And what do you care what happens after that? We'll fool them for 1 day, and tomorrow we'll be back in the work gang." Together the two of them barely managed to open the frozen door. In the middle of the carpentry shop stood a red-hot cast-iron stove. 5 carpenters were working without coats and hats at their benches. The new arrivals knelt before the stove's open door as if it were the god of fire, one of man's first gods. They threw down their mittens and stretched out their hands toward the warmth, but were not able to feel it immediately, since their hands were numb. In a minute, Grigoriev and Potashnikov knelt, took off their hats, and unbuttoned their padded jackets. "What are you doing here?" one of the carpenters asked with hostility. "We're carpenters." "We're going to work here," Grigoriev said. "Alexander Yevgenyevich," and so Potashnikov added hurriedly. "That means you're the ones the foreman's told us to give access to?" asked Arishtrin, the older man in charge of tools, who was planing shovel handles in the corner. "That's us. Here they are," Arishtrin said, looking them over skeptically. 2 axes, a saw, a tooth setter. "You'll return the tooth setter later. Here's my axe. Make yourself a handle with it." Arishtrin smiled. "You'll have to do 30 handles a day," he said. Grigoriev took the block of wood from Arishtrin's hands and began to hack away at it. The dinner horn sounded, but Arishtrin kept staring silently at Grigoriev's work. "Now you," he said to Potashnikov. Potashnikov put a log on the stump, took an axe from Grigoriev's hands, and began to trim the piece. The carpenters had all left for dinner, and there was no one left in the shop except the 3 men. "Take my 2 axe handles," Arishtrin said, handing the 2 ready pieces to Grigoriev, "and mount the heads. Sharpen the saw. You can stay warm at the stove today and tomorrow. After that, go back where you came from. Here's a piece of bread for dinner." They stayed warm at the stove those 2 days, and the following day it was only 27 degrees below zero. Winter was over. The first time I wrote, "Was there humanity between sex in the Gulag?" Shalamov says yes, and Solzhenitsyn says no. But perhaps just different experiences, different places. An individual assignment. That evening, the overseer rolled up his measuring tape and said that Dugayev would get an individual assignment for the next day. The foreman, who had been standing beside them and asking the overseer to credit his work gang with an extra 10 cubic meters of earth till the day after tomorrow, suddenly fell silent and stared at an evening star sparkling over the crest of the hill. Baranov, Dugayev's partner, who had been helping the overseer measure the amount of work done, picked up his shovel and began to clean the already cleaned pit. Dugayev was 23 years old, and everything everything that he saw and heard here amazed him more than surprised him. The work gang gathered for a head count, turned in its tools, and returned to the barracks in uneven convict formation. The difficult day was over. In the cafeteria, Dukayev, still standing, drank his bowl of cold, watery barley soup. The day's bread, issued in the morning, had long since been eaten. Dukayev wanted to smoke and looked around to consider who might give him a butt. Baranov was sitting on the windowsill, sprinkling some homegrown tobacco shreds from his tobacco pouch, which he had turned inside out. When he had carefully gathered them all up, he rolled a thin cigarette and handed it to Dukayev. Go ahead, he said, but leave me some. Dukayev was surprised, since he and Baranov had never been particularly friendly. Cold, hunger, and sleeplessness rendered any friendship impossible, and Dukayev, despite his youth, understood the falseness of the belief that friendship could be tempered by misery and tragedy. For friendship to be friendship, its foundation had to be laid before living conditions reached that last border beyond which no human emotion was left to a man, only mistrust, rage, and lies. Dukayev remembered well the Northern proverb that listed the 3 commandments of prison life: don't believe, don't fear, don't ask. Greedily, Dukayev inhaled the sweet smoke of homegrown tobacco, and his head began to spin. I'm getting weaker, he said. Baranov said nothing. Dukayev returned to the barracks, lay down, and closed his eyes. He had been sleeping badly of late because he was hungry all the time. His dreams were particularly tormenting. Loaves of bread, steamy, greasy soup. Unconsciousness took a long time coming, but he opened his eyes a half hour before it was time to go to work anyway. When the work gang arrived at its site, the group scattered among the assigned test pits. You wait here, said the foreman to Dukayev. The overseer will give you an assignment. Dukayev sat down on the ground. He was already exhausted enough to be totally indifferent to any change in his fate. The first wheelbarrows rattled along the board walkway, and shovels scraped against stone. Come over here, the overseer said to Dukayev. This is your place. He measured out the cubic area of the test pit and marked it with a piece of quartz. Up to here, he said. The carpenter will nail a board to the walkway for your wheelbarrow. Dump everything where everyone else does. Here are your shovel, pick, crowbar, and wheelbarrow. Now get a move on. Dukayev obediently began his work. It's better this way, he thought. No one could complain that he was not working well. Yesterday's farmers did not have to know that Dukayev was new to this sort of work, that he had enrolled in university right after school, and that he had now exchanged his student's existence for this mine where it was every man for himself. They did not have to understand that he had been exhausted and hungry for a long time, and that he did not know how to steal. The ability to steal was a primary virtue here, whatever it involved, from taking the bread of a fellow inmate to claiming bonuses of thousands of rubles for fictitious, non-existent accomplishments. No one would be concerned about the fact that Dukayev could not last a 16-hour workday. Dukayev swung his pick, hauled, dumped, and again swung his pick, and again hauled and dumped. After lunch, the overseer walked up, looked at Dukayev's process, and left without saying a word. Dukayev went on swinging his pick and dumping. It was still very far to the quartz marker. In the evening, the overseer appeared and unwound his tape measure. He measured the work that Dukayev had done, 25%, he said, and looked at Dugayev. Do you hear me? 25%. I hear you, Dugayev said. He was surprised at this figure. The work was so hard, the shovel picked up so little stone, and it was so difficult to swing the pick. 25% of the work quota seemed an enormous amount for Dugayev. His calves ached, and his arms and shoulders and head hurt from leaning into the wheelbarrow. The sensation of hunger had long since left him. Dugayev ate because he saw that the others were eating, and something prompted him that he should eat, though he did not want to. Well, I guess that's that, the overseer said, and he left. Good luck. That evening, Dugayev was summoned to the investigator. He answered 4 questions: first name, surname, crime, and sentence. These were the 4 questions that a prisoner had to answer 30 times a day. Later, Dugayev fell asleep. The next day, he was again working in the work gang with Baranov, and the following night the soldiers took him behind the horse barn, along a path that led into the woods. They came to a tall fence topped with barbed wire. The fence nearly blocked off a small ravine, and in the night the prisoners could hear tractors backfiring in the distance. When he realized what was about to happen, Dugayev regretted that he had worked for nothing. There had been no reason for him to exhaust himself on this, his last day. A pushover's job. The hills glistened white with a tinge of blue, like loaves of sugar. Round and bare forest, they were smothered with a layer of dense snow compacted by the winds. In the ravines, the snow was deep and firm. A man could stand on it, but on the slopes it swelled up in enormous blisters. These were the shrubs of Siberian dwarf cedar, which lay flat on the ground to hibernate through the winter. Even before the first snow fell, they were what we had come here for. Of all northern trees, I loved the dwarf cedar most of all. I had long since come to understand and appreciate the inevitable haste with which poor northern nature shared its meager wealth with equally indigent man, blossoming for him with every variety of flower. There were times when everything bloomed into a single week, and when only a month after the beginning of summer, the almost never setting sun would make the mountains flame red with cowberries, and then darken their deep blue. Rowan shrubs hung heavy with the full watery berries, so low you didn't even have to raise your hand. Only the petals of the mountain sweet briar smelled like flowers here. All the others exuded a sense of dampness, a swampy odor, and this seemed appropriate to the spring silence. Both of the birds and the large forest, whose branches slowly clothed themselves in green needles. The sweet briar clung to its fruit right into winter, and from under the snow stretched out to us its wrinkled, meaty berries, whose thick violet skin concealed a dark yellow flesh. I knew of the playful vines, which again and again changed their color in spring from dark rose to orange to pale green, as if they went stretched with dyed kidskin. The slender fingers of the large, with their green fingernails, seemed to grope everywhere, and the omnipresent, oily fireweed carpeted the scenes of former forest. blazes. All this was exquisite, trusting, boisterous, rushed, but all this was in summer, when the dull green grass mixed with the glades of mossy boulders that gleamed in the sun and seemed not gray or brown, but green. In winter it all disappeared, covered with a crusty snow cast into the ravines by the winds and beaten down so hard that to climb upward a man had to hack steps in the snow with an axe. Everything was so naked that a person in the forest could be seen half a mile away, and only one tree was always green, always alive, the dwarf cedar. The tree was a weatherman. The tree was a weatherman. 2 or 3 days before the first snow, the cloudless heat of fall, when no one wanted even to think of the oncoming winter, the dwarf cedar would suddenly stretch out its enormous 5-yard paws on the ground, lightly bend its straight black 2-fist-thick trunk, and lie prone on the earth. A day or two would pass, and a cloud would appear. Toward evening, a snowstorm would begin, and if in the late fall low gray snow clouds would gather, accompanied by a cold wind, and the dwarf cedar would not lie down, one could be sure that no snow would fall. Toward the end of March or in April, when there was still no trace of spring and the air was dry and rarefied as in winter, the dwarf cedar would suddenly rise up, shaking the snow from its reddish-green clothing. In a day or two, the wind would shift and warm streams of air would usher in spring. The dwarf cedar was a very precise instrument, sensitive to the point where it sometimes deceived itself, rising during a lengthy period of thaw, but it would hurriedly lie back down in the snow before the cold returned. Sometimes we would make a hot campfire in the morning to last till evening, so we could warm our hands and feet. We would heap on as many logs as possible and set off to work. In 2 or 3 hours, the dwarf cedar would stretch its branches out from under the snow and slowly right itself, thinking that spring had arrived. But before the fire could even go out, the tree would again lie back into the snow. Winter here is two-toned, a high pale blue sky and a white ground. Spring would lay bare the dirty yellow tags of fall, and the earth would be clothed in its beggar's garb for a long time, until the new greenery would gather its strength and begin to blossom furiously. In the midst of this pitiless winter and gloomy spring, the dwarf cedar would gleam and blindingly green and clear. Moreover, tiny cedar nuts grew on it, and its delicacy was shared by people, birds, bears, squirrels, and chipmunks. Having selected an area of the hill shielded from the wind, we dragged a considerable number of small and large branches into a heap and gathered some dry grass where the wind had bared the mountain. We had brought several smoking logs with us from the barrack stove. There were no matches here. We carried the logs in a large tin can with a wire handle attached, and had to be careful that they didn't go out along the way. Removing the charred logs from the can, we blew on them and set the smoldering ends together. I kept blowing until they began to burn, and then I set them on the dry grass and twigs. All this we covered with larger branches, and soon an uncertain tail of blue smoke trailed downwind. I had never before worked in gangs that gathered dwarf cedar needles. We did everything by hand, plucking the green, dry needles and stuffing them into sacks. In the evening, we handed them over to the foreman. The needles were hauled away to a mysterious vitamin factory where they were boiled down into a dark yellow viscous extract with an inexpressibly repulsive taste. Before each dinner, this extract had to be drunk or eaten, however a person could manage. Its taste spoiled not only dinner, but supper as well, and many considered this treatment a supplementary means of camp discipline. But without a shot glass of this medicine, it was impossible to get dinner in the cafeteria. The rule was strictly enforced. Scurvy was everywhere, and dwarf cedar was the only medically approved cure. It was ultimately proved that this preparation was completely ineffective in the cure of scurvy, and the vitamin factory was closed. Nevertheless, faith conquers all, and at the time, many drank this stinking abomination. Went away spitting, but eventually recovered from scurvy. Or they didn't recover, or they didn't drink it and recovered anyway. Everywhere were enormous clumps of sweet briar, but no one prepared it or used it against scurvy, since the instruction from Moscow said nothing about sweet briar. A few years later, sweet briar was brought in from the mainland, but it was never prepared locally. The instructions prescribed cedar needles as the only source of vitamin C. On that day, I was assigned to gather the precious raw material. I had gotten so weak that I was transferred from the gold mine to needle picking. I'll put you on dwarf cedar for a while, the job assigner told me in the morning. It'll be a pushover job for a few days. Needle picking was considered not just an easy job, but the easiest of all. Moreover, it didn't require the presence of a guard. After many months of work in the icy mines, where even sparklingly frozen stone burned the hand, after the clicks of rifle bolts, the barking dogs, the swearing of overseers behind our backs, needle gathering was an enormous pleasure. Physically felt with every exhausted muscle, needle gatherers were sent out after the others while it was still dark. It was a marvelous feeling to warm your hands against the can with the smoldering log and slowly set out for the seemingly unattainable peaks, to climb higher and higher, constantly aware of your own solitariness, and the deep winter silence of the mountains. It was as if everything evil in the world had been snuffed out, and only you and your companion existed on this narrow, dark, endless path in the snow leading upward into the mountains. My companion watched my slow motions disapprovingly. He had been gathering cedar needles for a long time, and correctly surmised in me a weak, clumsy partner. Work was done in pairs, and the wage was a joint one, divided 50-50. I'll chop and you pick, he said, and get a move on, or we won't fill our quota. I don't want to have to go back to the mines. He chopped down a few branches and dragged an enormous pile of green pods to the fire. I broke off the smaller branches and, starting with the top of each branch, pulled off the needles all together with the bark. They looked like green fringe. You'll have to work faster, my companion said, returning with a new armload. I could see that the work was not going well, but I couldn't work faster. There was ringing in my ears, and my fingers, frostbitten at the beginning of winter, ached with a familiar dull pain. I yanked at the needles, broke entire branches into smaller pieces without stripping the bark, and stuffed the product into the sack. The sack wouldn't fill. Before the fire rose a mountain of stripped branches that looked like washed bones. But the sack kept swelling and swelling, and accepting new armfuls of needles. My companion sat down next to me, and the work went faster. It's time to go, he suddenly said, or else we'll miss supper. We haven't got enough here for the quota. We took from the ashes of the fire a large stone and shoved it into the sack. They don't untie them there, he said, frowning. Now we've met our quota. I stood up and scattered the burning branches and kicked snow onto the red coals. The fire hissed and went out, and it immediately became cold. It was clear that evening was close. My companion helped me to heave the sack onto my back. I staggered under its weight. Try dragging it, my companion said. After all, we're going downhill, not up. We barely arrived in time to get our soup. No meat or vegetables were given for such light work. Tomorrow we'll start the next few chapters. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great day.